Friends, today we are reading out of Deuteronomy chapter 25, and I want to encourage you. We have reached the penultimate chapter of the law in this central section of Deuteronomy, and so tomorrow you will wrap this section up, and then next week we will head into a completely new movement of the book. The finish line for the law code is right in front of you. And I also need to call a spade a spade. Today we are reading a passage that is very awkward and a little bit uncomfortable. I feel a little bit awkward talking about this on camera. I'm sure you feel a little bit awkward reading about it. And today I think we are being challenged to push past the awkwardness to see God's heart and his intentions here, and to withhold our judgment, right? For our ancient Israelite neighbors, and to try and be good cultural tourists. Because that's what's happening. We are visiting a society today that existed thousands of years before our own in a completely different part of the world. So we're going to push past the awkwardness to see God's heart, and we're going to withhold our judgment for a different culture than our own today. We are talking about the practice of levirate marriage. I thought when I was reading Deuteronomy that levirate had something to do with the tribe of Levi. I was mistaken. It is the Latin word for brother-in-law. This is brother-in-law marriage, and that is exactly what Moses is decreeing here. He says, if in Israel there is a man who dies childless and leaves behind his wife as a widow, his brother is supposed to, her brother-in-law is supposed to take her as his wife and provide her with a child. Whoa, right? God said he should do what? Her brother-in-law? I told you, a little awkward today. So what is God's heart here? What is the purpose of levirate marriage? Well, one thing that I think is essential for you to know today is that this is not an Israelite thing. It is an ancient Near Eastern thing. If you look at the law codes of the Hittites and the Assyrians and other ancient Near Eastern nations, they also will have practices similar to this. And if you go back to Genesis 38, which we'll talk about in a second, you will see an earlier example of levirate marriage being practiced centuries, at least 4 centuries, before Moses speaks these words. So levirate marriage is long-standing and it is widespread. This is just a cultural norm. It is the water they are swimming in. But why would they codify it? Like, why take this practice and decide to put it into their legislation? There's a couple reasons. And I think that we will see them if we look at Deuteronomy 25 versus Genesis 38. Genesis 38 is the story of Judah and Tamar. And it's a sad story. Tamar is a widow, a childless widow. And in Genesis 38, we see that this practice of levirate marriage can be used and abused. It can be perverted to mistreat the widow instead of help her. Poor Tamar in this story gets passed from man to man within Judah's family. She's taken advantage of. She's left in limbo for years. And nobody marries her. She's not provided for. She has to take desperate measures on her own to try and provide for herself. And so we see that this practice can go horribly awry. And so Deuteronomy wants to put some very needed boundaries around it so that what happened to Tamar cannot happen to widows in Israel. They cannot be mistreated like she was. And so the widows in Deuteronomy are given agency to hold brothers-in-law accountable in front of the elders of her city, and he can be publicly shamed if he shirks his responsibility to her. So they cannot be abused like Tamar is in Genesis 38. And though this practice can be abused, Israel still puts it into its law code. God still incorporates it here in Deuteronomy because widows were vulnerable and nearly helpless in the ancient Near Eastern society. You have probably noticed as we have been reading Deuteronomy that when Moses talks about people who are poor, helpless, vulnerable, ostracized, marginalized, don't have a place to belong, the weirdos, the people on the fringes, he has this like shorthand way of referring to all of them by saying that Israel needs to look out for the orphans, the foreigners, and the widows. Widows had very little agency, no way to provide for themselves. And so they would become poor and quite helpless. And so this practice of having her brother-in-law marry her, it's not supposed to be twisted. It's supposed to be a way to provide for her in a society that treats her unfairly, right? And there's something quite radical within this practice, because if you think about it, part of the reason that widows need to have the agency and the authority to hold their brothers-in-law accountable is that this practice is not in his self-interest. It is not in his self-interest. If we think about what is in the economic and personal interest of the brother-in-law, if his family's land and wealth is split between him and his late brother, what does he want to do? His baser instincts, what does he want to do? Take all that his brother had, all that was supposed to be inherited by his kids, and take it for his own. And so for Deuteronomy to say that the brother-in-law is obligated to take her as his wife and provide her with a child is to say, do not act in your own self-interests here. Act in her interests instead. Do not be greedy. Do not be covetous of what your brother has and leave this widow to fend for herself. Put her interests above your own and care for her so that she will be provided for and her offspring can inherit what was supposed to be your late brother's. This is radical. And so when we push past the awkwardness, can you see God's heart here? Can you see the way he is drawing near to those who would be vulnerable and weak and in desperate need in the society? He comes close to them and provides. He creates humanity within the inhumane. And so this isn't God saying, this is my ideal for Israel. It's him baby stepping them towards what is his ideal. And let us not be judgmental, right? We know that in our society, though we have thousands of years advantage in terms of societal and moral progress, we still have people in our own society who feel marginalized, who feel helpless, who are on the fringes, who don't feel like they have a place to belong or anybody to look out for them. And so today in our society, how can Deuteronomy teach us to not be greedy? We've been blessed. We could keep it all for ourselves and only look out for ourselves and for our own. How is Deuteronomy encouraging us instead to act not in our self-interests, but in the interests of others? To put others above ourselves, and to be generous and compassionate. Friends, thank you for hanging in there with me in an odd, uncomfortable section. I will see you next time. Take care.